What's up, folks? I'm Dan, and welcome to I've Been Meaning to Read That, the show where I read books out loud that I've been meaning to read. Let's go. Guys, that last episode was nuts. I'm glad it was our 50th. So just to recap, many years ago, Villefort had an affair with Madame Danglars. Madame Danglars had a baby, and Villefort tried to kill the baby and bury it. It was rescued by Bertuccio because Bertuccio was waiting to kill Villefort. He stabbed Villefort and saw the baby and rescued it. That baby grew up to be Benedetto, who is now Cavalcanti. The Count found out about Benedetto, freed him from his prison, and then, because Benedetto sucks, and then he turned him into Cavalcanti so he could sabotage Monsieur Danglars' wedding plans of marrying Cavalcanti, who is not an actual real rich person, to his daughter Eugenie. And now Cavalcanti has been turned in, probably by the Count, actually definitely by the Count, to the cops, thus shattering Danglars' plan and putting Benedetto, who sucks, back on the run. And then, on top of that, Eugenie, who never wanted to get married to anybody anyways, dressed like a dude with her music teacher friend, Louise Darmely, and ran off to Italy. Now, a little side note about that. Was it just me, or did anybody else pick up on a little bit, are they more than friends vibe between Louise and Eugenie? I mean, I know I did. Now, I could just be reading into it, but let me know what you think. Leave a comment about how perfectly the Count's plans are going, or on what you think the exact nature of the relationship between Louise and Eugenie is. All right, let's find out what happens next. I can't wait any longer. Chapter 98, The Bell and Bottle Tavern. And now, let us leave Mademoiselle Danglars and her friend pursuing their way to Brussels, and return to poor Andrea Cavalcanti, so inopportunely interrupted in his rise to fortune. Notwithstanding his youth, Master Andrea was a very skillful and intelligent boy. We have seen that on the first rumor which reached the salon, he had gradually approached the door, and crossing 2 or 3 rooms, at last disappeared. But we have forgotten to mention one circumstance, which nevertheless ought not to be omitted. In one of the rooms he crossed, the trousseau of the bride-elect was on exhibition. There were caskets of diamonds, cashmere shawls, Valencian lace, English veils, and in fact all the tempting things, the bare mention of which makes the hearts of young girls bound with joy, and which is called the corbeille. Now, in passing through this room, Andrea proved himself not only to be clever and intelligent, but also provident, for he helped himself to the most valuable of the ornaments before him. Furnished with this plunder, Andrea leapt with a lighter heart from the window, intending to slip through the hands of the gendarme. Tall and well-proportioned as an ancient gladiator, and muscular as a Spartan, he walked for a quarter of an hour without knowing where to direct his steps, actuated by the sole idea of getting away from the spot where, if he lingered, he knew that he would surely be taken. Having passed through the Rue de Mont Blanc, guided by the instinct which leads thieves always to take the safest path, he found himself at the end of the Rue Lafayette. There he stopped, breathless and panting. He was quite alone. On one side was the vast wilderness of the Saint Lazare, on the other, Paris enshrouded in darkness. "Am I to be captured?" he cried. "No, not if I can use more activity than my enemies. My safety is now a mere question of speed." At this moment, he saw a cab at the top of the Faubourg Poissonnier. The dull driver, smoking his pipe, was plodding along towards the limits of the Faubourg Saint-Denis, where no doubt he ordinarily had his station. "Ho, friend," said Benedetto. "What do you want, sir?" asked the driver. "Is your horse tired?" "Tired? Oh, yes, tired enough. He has done nothing the whole of this blessed day. 4 wretched fares and 20 sous over, making in all 7 francs, are all that I have earned, and I ought to take 10 to the owner." "Will you add these 20 francs to the 7 you have?" "With pleasure, sir. 20 francs are not to be despised. Tell me what I am to do for this." "A very easy thing if your horse isn't tired." "I tell you he'll go like the wind, only tell me which way to drive." "Toward the Louvre." "Ah, I know the way.
You get good sweetened rum over there." "Exactly so. I merely wish to overtake one of my friends, with whom I am going to hunt tomorrow at Chapelle and Serval. He should have waited for me here with a cab till 11:30. It's 12, and, tired of waiting, he must have gone on." "It's likely." "Well, will you try and overtake him?" "Nothing I should like better." "If you do not overtake him before we will reach Bourget, you shall have 20 francs. If not before Louvre, 30.
"And if we do overtake him?"
40.
said Andrea, after a moment's hesitation, at the end of which he remembered that he might safely promise.
"That's all right," said the man. "Hop in and we're off. Whoop-la!"
Andrea got into the cab, which passed rapidly through the Faubourg Saint-Denis, along the Faubourg Saint-Martin, across the barrier, and threaded its way through the interminable Villette. They never overtook the chimerical friend, yet Andrea frequently inquired of people on foot whom he passed, and at the inns which were not yet closed, for a green cab and bay horse. And as there are a great many cabs to be seen on the road to the Low Countries, and as 9/10 of them are green, the inquiries increased at every step. Everyone had just seen it pass. It was only 500, 200, 100 steps in advance. At length they reached it, but it was not the friend. Once the cab was also passed by a calash rapidly whirled along by 2 post-horses.
"Ah," said Benedetto to himself, "if I only had that Britska, those 2 good post-horses, and above all, the passport that carries them on."
And he sighed deeply. The calash contained Mademoiselle Danglars and Mademoiselle d'Armilly.
"Hurry, hurry," said Andrea. "We must overtake him soon."
And the post-horse resumed the desperate gallop it had kept up since leaving the barrier, and arrived steaming at Louvre.
"Certainly," said Andrea. "I shall not overtake my friend, but I shall kill your horse. Therefore I had better stop. Here are 30 francs. I will sleep at the Cheval Rouge, and will secure a place in the first coach. Good night, friend."
And Benedetto, after placing 6 pieces of 5 francs each in the man's hand, leapt lightly onto the pathway. The cabman joyfully pocketed the sum and turned back on his road to Paris. Andrea pretended to go towards the hotel of the Cheval Rouge, but after leaning on instant against the door, and hearing the last sound of the cab, which was disappearing from view, he went on his road, and with a lusty stride soon traversed the space of 2 leagues. Then he rested. He must be near Chapelle and Serval, where he pretended to be going. It was not fatigue that stayed Andrea here. It was that he might form some resolution, adopt some plan. It would be impossible to make use of a diligence, equally so to engage post-horses. To travel either way, a passport was necessary. It was still more impossible to remain in the department of the Oise, one of the most open and strictly guarded in France. This was quite out of the question, especially to a man like Benedetto, perfectly conversant with criminal matters. He sat down by the side of the moat, buried his face in his hands, and reflected. 10 minutes after, he raised his head. His resolution was made. He threw some dust over the topcoat, which he had found time to unhook from the antechamber and button over his ball costume, and going to Chapelle and Serval, he knocked loudly at the door of the only inn in the place. The host opened. "My friend," said Benedetto, "I was coming from Montfontaine to Senlis, when my horse, which is a troublesome creature, stumbled and threw me. I must reach Compiègne tonight, or I shall cause deep anxiety to my family. Could you let me hire a horse of you?" An innkeeper has always a horse to let, whether it be good or bad. The host called the stable boy and ordered him to saddle Leblanc. Then he awoke his son, a child of 7 years, whom he ordered to ride before the gentleman and bring back the horse. Andrea gave the innkeeper 20 francs, and in taking them from his pocket, dropped a visiting card. This belonged to one of his friends at the Café de Paris, so that the innkeeper, picking it up after Benedetto had left, was convinced that he had let his horse to the Count of Malion, 25 Rue Saint-Dominique, that being the name and address on the card. Leblanc was not a fast animal, but he kept up an easy, steady pace. In 3.5 hours, Benedetto had traversed the 9 leagues which separated him from Compiègne, and 4 o'clock struck as he reached the place where the coaches stop. There is an excellent tavern at Compiègne, well remembered by those who have ever been there. Benedetto, who had often stayed there in his rides about Paris, recollected the Bell and Bottle Inn. He turned around, saw the sign by the light of a reflected lamp, and having dismissed the child, giving him all the small coin he had about him, He began knocking at the door, very reasonably concluding that having now 3 or 4 hours before him, he had best fortify himself against the fatigues of the morrow by a sound sleep and a good supper. A waiter opened the door.
"My friend," said Benedetto, "I have been dining at Saint-Jean-au-Bois and expected to catch the coach which passes by at midnight, but like a fool I have lost my way and have been walking for the last 4 hours in the forest. Show me into one of those pretty little rooms which overlook the court, and bring me a cold fowl and a bottle of Bordeaux."
The waiter had no suspicions. Benedetto spoke with perfect composure. He had a cigar in his mouth, and his hands in the pocket of his topcoat. His clothes were fashionably made, his chin smooth, his boots irreproachable. He looked merely as if he had stayed out very late, that was all. While the waiter was preparing his room, the hostess arose. Benedetto assumed his most charming smile, and asked if he could have number 3, which he had occupied on his last stay at Compiègne. Unfortunately, number 3 was engaged by a young man who was traveling with his sister. Benedetto appeared in despair, but consoled himself when the hostess assured him that number 7, prepared for him, was situated precisely the same as number 3, and while warming his feet and chatting about the last races at Chantilly, he waited until they announced his room to be ready. Benedetto had not spoken without cause of the pretty rooms looking out upon the court of the Belle Hotel, which, with its triple galleries like those of a theater, with the jessamine and clematis twining around the light columns, forms one of the prettiest entrances to an inn that you can imagine. The fowl was tender, the wine old, the fire clear and sparkling, and Benedetto was surprised to find himself eating with as good an appetite as though nothing had happened. Then he went to bed, and almost immediately fell into that deep sleep which is sure to visit men of 20 years of age, even when they are torn with remorse. Now, here we are obliged to own that Benedetto ought to have felt remorse, but that he did not. This was the plan which had appealed to him to afford the best chance of his security. Before daybreak he would awake, leave the inn after rigorously paying his bill, and reaching the forest, he would, under pretense of making studies in painting, test the hospitality of some peasants, procure himself the dress of a woodcutter and a hatchet, casting off the lion's skin to assume that of the woodman. Then, with his hands covered with dirt, his hair darkened by means of a leaden comb, his complexion embrowned with a preparation for which one of his old comrades had given him the recipe, he intended, by following the wooded districts, to reach the nearest frontier, walking by night and sleeping in the day in the forests and quarries, and only entering inhabited regions to buy a loaf from time to time. Once past the frontier, Andrea proposed making money of his diamonds, and by uniting the proceeds to 10 banknotes he always carried about with him in case of accident, he would then find himself possessor of about 50,000 livres, which he philosophically considered as no very deplorable condition after all. Moreover, he reckoned much on the interest of the Danglars to hush up the rumor of their own misadventures. These were the reasons which, added to the fatigue, caused Benedetto to sleep so soundly. In order that he might wake early, he did not close the shutters, but contented himself with bolting the door and placing on the table an unclasped and long-pointed knife, whose temper he well knew, and which was never absent from him. About 7 in the morning, Andrea was awakened by a ray of sunlight, which played, warm and brilliant, upon his face. In all well-organized brains, the predominating idea, and there always is one, is sure to be the last thought before sleeping, and the first upon waking in the morning. Andrea had scarcely opened his eyes when his predominating idea presented itself, and whispered in his ear that he had slept too long. He jumped out of bed and ran to the window. A gendarme was crossing the court. A gendarme is one of the most striking objects in the world, even to a man void of uneasiness, but for one who has a timid conscience, and with good cause too, the yellow, blue, and white uniform is really very alarming.
"Why is that gendarme there?"
asked Benedetto of himself. Then, all at once, he replied, with that logic which the reader has, doubtless, remarked in him,
"There is nothing astonishing in seeing a gendarme at an inn. Instead of being astonished, let me dress myself."
And the youth dressed himself with a facility his valet had failed to rob him of during the 2 months of fashionable life he had led in Paris.
"Now then," said Benedetto while dressing himself, "I'll wait till he leaves, and then slip away."
And, saying this, Benedetto, who had now put on his boots and cravat, stole gently to the window, and a second time lifted up the muslin curtain. Not only was the first gendarme still there,
But the young man now perceived a second yellow, blue, and white uniform at the foot of the staircase, the only one by which he could descend, while a third, on horseback, holding a musket in his fist, was posted as a sentinel at the great street door which alone afforded the means of egress. The appearance of the third gendarme settled the matter, for a crowd of curious loungers was extended before him, effectually blocking the entrance of the hotel. "They're after me," was Benedetto's first thought. "Diable!" A pallor overspread the young man's forehead, and he looked around him with anxiety. His room, like all those on the same floor, had but one outlet to the gallery in the sight of everybody. "I am lost," was his second thought, and indeed, for a man in Benedetto's situation, an arrest meant the assizes, trial, and death without mercy or delay. For a moment he convulsively pressed his head within his hands, and during that brief period he became nearly mad with terror. But soon a ray of hope glimmered in the multitude of thoughts which bewildered his mind, and a faint smile played upon his white lips and pallid cheeks. He looked around and saw the objects of his search upon the chimney-piece. They were a pen, ink, and paper. With forced composure he dipped the pen in the ink and wrote the following lines upon a sheet of paper. "I have no money to pay my bill, but I am not a dishonest man. I leave behind me as a pledge this pin, worth 10 times the amount. I shall be excused for leaving at daybreak, for I was ashamed." He then drew the pin from his cravat and placed it on the paper. This done, instead of leaving the door fastened, he drew back the bolts and even placed the door ajar, as though he had left the room, forgetting to close it, and slipping into the chimney like a man accustomed to that kind of gymnastic exercise. After replacing the chimney board, which represented Achilles with diademia, and effacing the very marks of his feet upon the ashes, he commenced climbing the hollow tunnel, which afforded him the only means of escape left. At this precise time, the first gendarme Benedetto had noticed walked upstairs, preceded by the commissary of police, and supported by the second gendarme, who guarded the staircase and was himself reinforced by the one stationed at the door. Benedetto was indebted for this visit to the following circumstances. At daybreak, the telegraphs were set at work in all directions, and almost immediately the authorities in every district had exerted their utmost endeavors to arrest the murderer of Caderousse. Compiègne, that royal residence and fortified town, is well furnished with authorities, gendarmes, and commissaries of police. They therefore began operations as soon as the telegraphic dispatch arrived, and the Bell and Bottle being the best-known hotel in the town, they had naturally directed their first inquiries there. Now, besides the reports of the sentinels guarding the Hôtel de Ville, which is next door to the Bell and Bottle, it had been stated by others that a number of travelers had arrived during the night. The sentinel, who was relieved at 6 o'clock in the morning, remembered perfectly that, just as he was taking his post a few minutes past 4, a young man arrived on horseback with a little boy before him. The young man, having dismissed the boy and horse, knocked at the door of the hotel, which was opened, and again closed after his entrance. This late arrival had attracted much suspicion, and the young man being no other than Benedetto, the commissary and gendarme, who was a brigadier, directed their steps towards his room. They found the door ajar. "Oh," said the brigadier, who thoroughly understood the trick. "A bad sign to find the door open. I would rather find it triply bolted." And indeed, the little note and pin upon the table confirmed, or rather corroborated, the sad truth. Benedetto had fled. We say corroborated because the brigadier was too experienced to be convinced by a single proof. He glanced around, looked in the bed, shook the curtains, opened the closets, and finally stopped at the chimney. Benedetto had taken the precaution to leave no traces of his feet in the ashes, but still it was an outlet, and in this light was not to be passed over without serious investigation. The brigadier sent for some sticks and straw, and having filled the chimney with them, set a light to it. The fire crackled, and the smoke ascended like the dull vapor from a volcano. But still no prisoner fell down, as they had expected. The fact was that Benedetto, at war with society ever since his youth, was quite as deep as a gendarme, even though he were advanced to the rank of brigadier, and quite prepared for the fire. He had climbed out onto the roof and was crouching down against the chimney pots. At one time he thought he was saved, for he heard the brigadier exclaim in a loud voice to the two gendarmes, "He's not here!" But venturing to peep, he perceived that the latter, instead of retiring, as might have been reasonably expected upon this announcement, were watching with increased attention. It was now his turn to look about him. The Hôtel de Ville, a massive 16th-century building, was on his right, anyone could descend from the openings in the tower and examine every corner of the roof below, and Benedetto expected momentarily to see the head of a gendarme appear at one of these openings. If once discovered, he knew he would be lost, for the roof afforded no chance of escape. He therefore resolved to descend, not through the same chimney by which he had come up, but by a similar one conducting to another room. He looked around for a chimney from which no smoke issued, and having reached it, he disappeared through the orifice without being seen by anyone. At the same minute, one of the little windows of the Hôtel de Ville was thrown open, and the head of a gendarme appeared. For an instant it remained motionless as one of the stone decorations of the building. Then, after a long sigh of disappointment, the head disappeared. The brigadier, calm and dignified as the law he represented, passed through the crowd without answering the 1,000 questions addressed to him, and re-entered the hotel. "Well?" asked the two gendarmes. "Well, my boys," said the brigadier, "the brigand must really have escaped early this morning, but we will send to the Villers, Cotterets, and Noyon roads and search the forest, when we shall catch him, no doubt." The honorable functionary had scarcely expressed himself thus, in that intonation which is peculiar to brigadiers of the gendarmerie, when a loud scream, accompanied by the violent ringing of a bell, resounded through the court of the hotel. "Ah, what's that?" cried the brigadier.
"Some traveler seems impatient," said the host. "What number was it that rang?"
"Number 3?
"Run, waiter."
At this moment the screams and ringing were redoubled. "Aha!" said the brigadier, stopping the servant. "The person who is ringing appears to want something more than a waiter. We will attend upon him with a gendarme. Who occupies number 3?
"The little fellow who arrived last night in a post-chaise with his sister, and who asked for an apartment with 2 beds.
The bell here rang for the 3rd time, with another shriek of anguish. "Follow me, Mr. Commissary," said the brigadier. "Tread in my steps."
"Wait an instant," said the host. "Number 3 has 2 staircases, inside and out."
"Good," said the brigadier. "I will take charge of the inside one. Are the carbines loaded?"
"Yes, brigadier."
"Well, you guard the exterior, and if he attempts to fly, fire upon him. He must be a great criminal, from what the telegraph says." The brigadier, followed by the commissary, disappeared by the inside staircase, accompanied by the noise which his assertions respecting Benedetto had excited in the crowd. This is what had happened. Benedetto had very cleverly managed to descend 2/3 of the chimney, but then his foot slipped, and notwithstanding his endeavors, he came into the room with more speed and noise than he intended. It would have signified little had the room been empty, but unfortunately it was occupied. 2 ladies, sleeping in one bed, were awakened by the noise, and fixing their eyes upon the spot whence the sound proceeded, they saw a man. One of these ladies, the fair one, uttered those terrible shrieks which resounded through the house, while the other, rushing to the bell rope, rang with all her strength. Benedetto, as we can see, was surrounded by misfortune. "For pity's sake," he cried, pale and bewildered, without seeing whom he was addressing. "For pity's sake, do not call assistance. Save me. I will not harm you."
"Andrea, the murderer!" cried one of the ladies.
"Eugenie, Mademoiselle Danglars!" exclaimed Benedetto, stupefied.
"Help! Help!"
cried Mademoiselle d'Armilly, taking the bell from her companion's hand and ringing it yet more violently. "Save me, I am pursued," said Andrea, clasping his hands. "For pity, for mercy's sake, do not deliver me up." "It is too late, they are coming," said Eugenie. "Well, conceal me somewhere. You can say you were needlessly alarmed. You can turn their suspicions and save my life." The 2 ladies, pressing closely to one another, and drawing the bedclothes tightly around them, remained silent to this supplicating voice, repugnance and fear taking possession of their minds. "Well, be it so," at length said Eugenie. "Return by the same road you came, and we will say nothing about you, unhappy wretch." "Here he is! Here he is!" cried a voice from the landing. "Here he is! I see him!" The brigadier had put his eye to the keyhole, and had discovered Benedetto in a posture of entreaty. A violent blow from the butt end of the musket burst open the lock. 2 more forced out the bolts, and the broken door fell in. Benedetto ran to the other door, leading to the gallery, ready to rush out. But he was stopped short, and he stood with his body a little thrown back, pale, and with the useless knife in his clenched hand. "Fly, then," cried Mademoiselle d'Armilly. whose pity returned as her fears diminished. "Fly, or kill yourself," said Eugenie, in a tone which a Vestal in the amphitheater would have used when urging the victorious gladiator to finish his vanquished adversary. Benedetto shuddered and looked on the young girl with an expression which proved how little he understood such ferocious honor. "Kill myself?" he cried, throwing down his knife. "Why should I do so?" "Why, you said," answered Mademoiselle Danglars, "that you would be condemned to die like the worst criminals." "Bah!" said Benedetto, crossing his arms. "One has friends." The brigadier advanced to him, sword in hand. "Come, come," said Benedetto. "Sheathe your sword, my fine fellow. There is no occasion to make such a fuss, since I give myself up." And he held out his hands to be manacled. The two girls looked with horror upon this shameful metamorphosis, the man of the world shaking off his covering and appearing as a galley slave. Benedetto turned towards them, and with an impertinent smile asked, "Have you any message for your father, Mademoiselle Danglars? For in all probability I shall return to Paris." Eugenie covered her face with her hands. "Ha ha," said Benedetto. "You need not be ashamed, even though you did post after me. Was I not nearly your husband?" And with this raillery Benedetto went out, leaving the two girls a prey to their own feelings of shame and to the comments of the crowd. An hour after, they stepped into their calash, both dressed in feminine attire. The gate of the hotel had been closed to screen them from sight, but they were forced, when the door was open, to pass through a throng of curious glances and whispering voices. Eugenie closed her eyes, but though she could not see, she could hear, and the sneers of the crowd reached her in the carriage. "Oh, why is not the world a wilderness?" she exclaimed, throwing herself into the arms of Mademoiselle d'Armilly, her eyes sparkling with the same kind of rage which made Nero wish that the Roman world had but one neck, that he might sever it at a single blow. The next day they stopped at the Hôtel de Flandre at Brussels. The same evening, Benedetto was incarcerated in the conciergerie. End of chapter 98. Chapter 99. The Law. We have seen how quietly Mademoiselle Danglars and Mademoiselle d'Armilly accomplished their transformation in flight, the fact being that everyone was too much occupied in his or her own affairs to think of theirs. We will leave the banker contemplating the enormous magnitude of his debt before the phantom of bankruptcy, and follow the Baroness, who, after being momentarily crushed under the weight of the blow which had struck her, had gone to seek her usual adviser, Lucien Debray. The Baroness had looked forward to this marriage as a means of ridding her of a guardianship which, over a girl of Eugenie's character, could not fail to be rather a troublesome undertaking. For in the tacit relations which maintain the bond of family union, the mother, to maintain her ascendancy over her daughter, must never fail to be a model of wisdom and a type of perfection. Now, Madame Danglars feared Eugenie's sagacity and the influence of Mademoiselle d'Armilly. She had frequently observed the contemptuous expressions with which her daughter looked upon Debray, an expression which seemed to imply that she understood all her mother's amorous and pecuniary relationships with the intimate secretary. Moreover, she saw that Eugenie detested Debray, not only because he was a source of dissension and scandal under the paternal roof, but because she had at once classed him in that catalogue of bipeds whom Plato endeavors to withdraw from the appellation of men, and whom Diogenes designated as animals upon two legs without feathers. Unfortunately, in this world of ours, each person views things through a certain medium, and so is prevented from seeing in the same light as others, and Madame Danglars, therefore, very much regretted that the marriage of Eugenie had not taken place, not only because the match was good and likely to ensure the happiness of her child, but because it would also set her at liberty. She ran, therefore, to Debray, who, after having, like the rest of Paris, witnessed the contract scene and the scandal attending it, had retired in haste to his club, where he was chatting with some friends upon the events which served as a subject of conversation for 3/4 of that city known as the capital of the world. At the precise time when Madame Danglars, dressed in black and concealed in a long veil, was ascending the stairs leading to Debray's apartments, notwithstanding the assurances of the concierge that the young man was not at home, Debray was occupied in repelling the insinuations of a friend, who tried to persuade him that after the terrible scene which had just taken place he ought, as a friend of the family, to marry Mademoiselle Danglars and her 2 millions. Debray did not defend himself very warmly,
for the idea had sometimes crossed his mind. Still, when he recollected the independent, proud spirit of Eugenie, he positively rejected it as utterly impossible, though the same thought again continually recurred and found a resting place in his heart. Tea, play, and the conversation, which had become interesting during the discussion of such serious affairs, lasted till 1 o'clock in the morning. Meanwhile, Madame Danglars, veiled and uneasy, awaited the return of Debray in the little green room, seated between 2 baskets of flowers, which she had that morning sent, and which, it must be confessed, Debray had himself arranged and watered with so much care that his absence was half excused in the eyes of the poor woman. At 20 minutes to 12, Madame Danglars, tired of waiting, returned home. Women of a certain grade are like prosperous grisettes in one respect. They seldom return home after 12 o'clock. The Baroness returned to the hotel with as much caution as Eugenie used in leaving it. She ran lightly upstairs and, with an aching heart, entered her apartment, contiguous, as we know, to that of Eugenie. She was fearful of exciting any remark and believed firmly in her daughter's innocence and fidelity to the paternal roof. She listened at Eugenie's door, and hearing no sound, tried to enter, but the bolts were in place. Madame Danglars then concluded that the young girl had been overcome with the terrible excitement of the evening and had gone to bed and to sleep. She called the maid and questioned her. "Mademoiselle Eugenie," said the maid, "retired to her apartment with Mademoiselle Darmely. They then took tea together, after which they desired me to leave, saying that they needed me no longer." Since then, the maid had been below, and like everyone else, she thought the young ladies were in their own room. Madame Danglars, therefore, went to bed without a shadow of suspicion, and began to muse over the recent events. In proportion as her memory became clearer, the occurrences of the evening were revealed in their true light. What she had taken for confusion was a tumult. What she had regarded as something distressing was in reality a disgrace. And then the Baroness remembered that she had felt no pity for poor Mercedes, who had been afflicted with as severe a blow through her own husband and son. "Eugenie," she said to herself, "is lost, and so are we. The affair, as it will be reported, will cover us with shame, for in a society such as ours, satire inflicts a painful and incurable wound. How fortunate that Eugenie is possessed of that strange character which has so often made me tremble." And her glance was turned towards heaven, where a mysterious providence disposes all things, and out of a fault, nay, even a vice, sometimes produces a blessing. And then her thoughts, cleaving through space like a bird in the air, rested on Cavalcanti. This Andrea was a wretch, a robber, an assassin, and yet his manners showed the effects of a sort of education, if not a complete one. He had been presented to the world with the appearance of an immense fortune, supported by an honorable name. How could she extricate herself from this labyrinth? To whom should she apply to help her out of this painful situation? Debray, to whom she had run, with the first instinct of a woman towards the man she loves, and who yet betrays her, Debray could but give her advice. She must apply to someone more powerful than he. The Baroness then thought of Monsieur de Villefort. It was Monsieur de Villefort who had remorselessly brought misfortune into her family, as though they had been strangers. But no, on reflection, the procureur was not a merciless man. It was not the magistrate, slave to his duties, but the friend, the loyal friend, who roughly but firmly cut into the very core of the corruption. It was not the executioner, but the surgeon, who wished to withdraw the honor of Danglars from ignominious association with the disgraced young man they had presented to the world as their son-in-law. And since Villefort, the friend of Danglars, had acted in this way, no one could suppose that he had been previously acquainted with, or had lent himself to, any of Andrea's intrigues. Villefort's conduct, therefore, upon reflection, appeared to the Baroness as if shaped for their mutual advantage. But the inflexibility of the procureur should stop there. She would see him the next day, and if she could not make him fail in his duties as a magistrate, she would, at least, obtain all the indulgence he could allow. She would invoke the past, recall old recollections, and she would supplicate him by the remembrance of guilty yet happy days. Monsieur de Villefort would stifle the affair. He had only to turn his eyes on one side and allow Andrea to fly, and follow up the crime under that shadow of guilt called contempt of court. And after this reasoning, she slept easily.
At 9 o'clock the next morning she arose, and without ringing for her maid or giving the least sign of her activity, she dressed herself in the same simple style as on the previous night. Then, running downstairs, she left the hotel, walked to the Rue de Provence, called a cab, and drove to Monsieur de Villefort's house. For the last month, this wretched house had presented the gloomy appearance of a lazaretto infected with the plague. Some of the apartments were closed within and without. The shutters were only open to admit a minute's air, showing the scared face of a footman, and immediately afterwards the window would be closed like a gravestone falling on a sepulchre, and the neighbors would say to each other in a low voice, "Will there be another funeral today at the procuror's house?" Madame Danglars involuntarily shuddered at the desolate aspect of the mansion. Descending from the cab, she approached the door with trembling knees and rang the bell. 3 times did the bell ring with a dull, heavy sound, seeming to participate in the general sadness, before the concierge appeared and peeped through the door, which he opened just wide enough to allow his words to be heard. He saw a lady, a fashionable, elegantly dressed lady, and yet the door remained almost closed. "Do you intend opening the door?" said the Baroness. "First, madam, who are you?" "Who am I? You know me well enough." "We no longer know anyone, madam." "You must be mad, my friend," said the Baroness. "Where do you come from?" "Oh, this is too much." "Madam, these are my orders. Excuse me. Your name?" "The Baroness Danglars. You have seen me 20 times. "Possibly, madam. And now, what do you want?" "Oh, how extraordinary! I shall complain to Monsieur de Villefort of the impertinence of his servants." "Madam, this is precaution, not impertinence. No one enters here without an order from Monsieur d'Avrigny, or without speaking to the procureur." "Well, I have business with the procureur." "Is it pressing?" "You can imagine so, since I have not even brought my carriage out yet. But enough of this. Here is my card. Take it to your master." "Will madam await my return?" "Yes, go." The concierge closed the door, leaving Madame Danglars in the street. She had not long to wait. Directly afterwards, the door was opened wide enough to admit her, and when she had passed through, it was again shut. Without losing sight of her for an instant, the concierge took a whistle from his pocket as soon as they entered the court and blew it. The valet appeared on the doorsteps. "You will excuse this poor fellow, madam," he said, as he preceded the Baroness, "but his orders are precise, and Monsieur de Villefort begged me to tell you that he could not act otherwise." In the court, showing his merchandise, was a tradesman who had been admitted with the same precautions. The Baroness ascended the steps. She felt herself strongly infected with the sadness which seemed to magnify her own, and still guided by the valet, who never lost sight of her for an instant, she was introduced to the magistrate's study. Preoccupied as Madame Danglars had been with the object of her visit, the treatment she had received from these underlings appeared to her so insulting that she began by complaining of it. But Villefort, raising his head, which had been bowed down by grief, looked up at her with so sad a smile that her complaints died upon her lips. "Forgive my servants," he said, "for a terror I cannot blame them for. From being suspected, they have become suspicious." Madame Danglars had often heard of the terror to which the magistrate alluded, but without the evidence of her own eyesight, she could never have believed that the sentiment had been carried so far. "You too, then, are unhappy?" she said. "Yes, madam," replied the magistrate. "Then you pity me?" "Sincerely, madam." "And you understand what brings me here?" "You wish to speak to me about the circumstance which has just happened?" "Yes, sir, a fearful misfortune." "You mean a mischance?" "A mischance?" repeated the Baroness. "Alas, madam," said the procureur with his imperturbable calmness of manner, "I consider those alone misfortunes which are irreparable." "And do you suppose this will be forgotten?" "Everything will be forgotten, madame," said Villefort. "Your daughter will be married tomorrow, if not today, in a week, if not tomorrow, and I do not think you can regret the intended husband of your daughter." Madame Danglars gazed on Villefort, stupefied to find him so almost insultingly calm. "Am I come to a friend?" she asked in a tone full of mournful dignity. "You know that you are, madam," said Villefort, whose pale cheeks became slightly flushed as he gave her the assurance. and truly this assurance carried him back to different events from those now occupying the Baroness and him.
"Well then, be more affectionate, my dear Villefort," said the Baroness. "Speak to me not as magistrate, but as a friend, and when I am in bitter anguish of spirit, do not tell me that I ought to be gay."
Villefort bowed.
"When I hear misfortunes named, madam," he said, "I have within the last few months contracted the bad habit of thinking of my own, and then I cannot help drawing up an egotistical parallel in my mind. That is the reason that by the side of my misfortunes, yours appear to me mere mischance. That is why my dreadful position makes yours appear enviable. But this annoys you. Let us change the subject. You were saying, madam—"
"I come to ask you, my friend," said the Baroness, "what will be done with this impostor?"
"Impostor," repeated Villefort. "Certainly, madam, you appear to extenuate some cases and exaggerate others. Impostor, indeed. Monsieur Andrea Cavalcanti, or rather Monsieur Benedetto, is nothing more nor less than an assassin."
"Sir, I do not deny the justice of your correction, but the more severely you arm yourself against that unfortunate man, the more deeply will you strike our family. Come, forget him for a moment, and instead of pursuing him, let him go."
"You are too late, madame. The orders are issued."
"Well, should he be arrested? Do they think they will arrest him?"
"I hope so."
"If they should arrest him, I know that sometimes prisons afford means of escape. Will you leave him in prison?"
The procureur shook his head.
"At least keep him there till my daughter be married?"
"Impossible, madam. Justice has its formalities."
"What, even for me?"
said the Baroness, half jesting, half in earnest.
"For all, even for myself among the rest," replied Villefort.
"Ah!"
exclaimed the Baroness, without expressing the ideas which the exclamation betrayed. Villefort looked at her with that piercing glance which reads the secrets of the heart.
"Yes, I know what you mean," he said. "You refer to the terrible rumors spread abroad in the world, that the deaths which have kept me in mourning for the last 3 months, and from which Valentine has only escaped by a miracle, have not happened by natural means."
"I was not thinking of that," replied Madame Danglars quickly.
"Yes, you were thinking of it, and with justice. You could not help thinking of it, and saying to yourself, you who pursue crime so vindictively, answer now, why are there unpunished crimes in your dwelling?"
The Baroness became pale.
"You were saying this, were you not?"
"Well, I own it."
"I will answer you."
Villefort drew his armchair nearer to Madame Danglars. Then, resting both hands upon his desk, he said in a voice more hollow than usual,
"There are crimes which remain unpunished because the criminals are unknown, and we might strike the innocent instead of the guilty. But when the culprits are discovered—"
Villefort here extended his hand towards a large crucifix placed opposite to his desk.
"When they are discovered, I swear to you by all I hold most sacred, that whoever they may be, they shall die. Now, after the oath I have just taken, and which I will keep, madame, dare you ask for mercy for that wretch?"
"But, sir, are you sure he is as guilty as they say?"
"Listen, this is his description. Benedetto, condemned at the age of 16 for 5 years to the galleys for forgery. He promised well, as you see, first a runaway, then an assassin."
"And who is this wretch?"
"Who can tell? A vagabond, a Corsican."
"Has no one owned him?"
"No one. His parents are unknown."
"But who is the man who brought him from Lucca?"
"Another rascal like himself, perhaps his accomplice."
The Baroness clasped her hands.
"Villefort,"
she exclaimed in her softest and most captivating manner.
"For heaven's sake, madam,"
said Villefort, with a firmness of expression not altogether free from harshness,
"for heaven's sake, do not ask pardon of me for a guilty wretch. What am I? The law. Has the law any eyes to witness your grief? Has the law ears to be melted by your sweet voice? Has the law a memory for all those soft recollections you endeavor to recall? No, madam, The law has commanded, and when it commands, it strikes. You will tell me that I am a living being and not a code, a man and not a volume. Look at me, madame. Look around me. Has mankind treated me as a brother? Have men loved me? Have they spared me? Has anyone shown the mercy towards me that you now ask at my hands? No, madam. They struck me, always struck me. Woman, siren that you are, do you persist in fixing on me that fascinating eye which reminds me that I ought to blush? Well, be it so. Let me blush for the faults you know, and perhaps for even more than those. But having sinned myself, it may be more deeply than others, I never rest till I have torn the disguises from my fellow creatures and found out their weaknesses. I have always found them, and more. I repeat it with joy, with triumph. I have always found some proof of human perversity or error. Every criminal I condemn seems to me living evidence that I am not a hideous exception to the rest. Alas, alas, alas. All the world is wicked. Let us therefore strike at wickedness. Villefort pronounced these last words with a feverish rage, which gave a ferocious eloquence to his words. But, said Madame Danglars, resolving to make a last effort, this young man, though a murderer, is an orphan, abandoned by everyone. So much the worse, or rather, so much the better. It has been ordained that he may have none to weep his fate. But this is trampling on the weak, sir. The weakness of a murderer. His dishonor reflects upon us. Is not death in my house? Oh, sir, exclaimed the Baroness, you are without pity for others. Well then, I tell you they will have no mercy on you. Be it so, said Villefort, raising his arms to heaven with a threatening gesture. At least delay the trial till the next assizes. We shall then have 6 months before us. No, madam, said Villefort. Instructions have been given. There are yet 5 days left. 5 days are more than I require. Do you not think that I also long for forgetfulness? While working night and day, I sometimes lose all recollection of the past, and then I experience the same sort of happiness I can imagine the dead feel. Still, it is better than suffering. But, sir, he has fled. Let him escape. Inaction is a pardonable offense. I tell you it is too late. Early this morning the telegraph was employed, and at this very minute— Sir, said the valet, entering the room, a dragoon has brought this dispatch from the Minister of the Interior. Villefort seized the letter and hastily broke the seal. Madame Danglars trembled with fear. Villefort started with joy. Arrested, he exclaimed. He was taken at Compiègne. All is over. Madame Danglars rose from her seat, pale and cold. Adieu, sir, she said. Adieu, madam, replied the king's attorney, as in an almost joyful manner he conducted her to the door. Then, turning to his desk, he said, striking the letter with the back of his right hand, Come, I had a forgery, 3 robberies, and 2 cases of arson. I only wanted a murder, and here it is. It will be a splendid session. End of chapter 99.
And cut. That's a wrap, folks. Thanks for listening to today's episode of I've Been Meaning to Read That, with me, your host, Dan. If you want to learn more about the show, you can follow us on Instagram at Meaning to Read and TikTok at I've Been Meaning. If you want to support the show to help keep it going, you can find me on Venmo at Dingus Donut, DINGUSDONUT. Supporters get a shout out on the show, and even more important, get to vote on the next book that we read. No matter what, I'll see you for our next episode. Until then, read those books you've been meaning to read, and have a lovely, lovely day.